Hi, I'm Tom Collins, Executive Director of the Arizona Citizens Clean Elections Commission. And I'm here today with Sarah Porter, who directs the Kyl Center for Water Policy at Arizona State University and is an attorney and the state's leading expert in water policy. And we're here today to talk a little bit about issues related to water and water conservation. Clean Elections recently did a survey of voters around the state, different regions and different parties, to look at the issues that they want to hear more about from candidates. And one of the issues that they identified was water conservation. So we thought there's no better person in Arizona to ask than Sarah Porter. And so we're grateful for her to be here today. Thank you so much.
I'm happy to be here today, Tom. Thanks for asking me.
Sarah, we see a lot of pictures on social media now that sort of seem to represent the issue of water and water conservation to voters, reservoirs at low levels and those kinds of things. What are the things that you think of when voters talk about water conservation? What are the things that folks need to be aware of?
Well, one important thing to remember is that the state doesn't have just one source of water. So most of the more concerning stories and visuals that we're seeing relate to the Colorado River system, which historically has provided about 40% of Arizona's water. And most of that water goes either to communities along the main stem of the Colorado River, which is Arizona's western border, including Yuma, which is a large agricultural area, and then also to central Arizona, to the Central Arizona Project Service Area, and CAP serves communities and farms and tribes in Maricopa, Pinal, and Pima counties. So that is a significant supply of water, and we are reckoning with rapidly declining supplies of water in the two big reservoirs that hold Colorado River water for Arizona and our neighboring states. So that's one important fact. We also have other supplies of water, including groundwater, which in our most populous parts of the state, we're trying to manage sustainably so that we don't take out more groundwater that's put in, with mixed success. We've been trying to do that since we passed our groundwater code in 1980. And then we also have other surface water supplies. The biggest one is our in-state system that SRP manages, the Salt Verde system. So it's important to keep and then let me just add, there's also a fourth water supply, which is becoming increasingly important and used, and that's the water that gets recycled. It's water that is captured in the water treatment system, and it's treated to be clean again. It can be reused in all kinds of ways. So the one thing to remember is when we talk about declines in Colorado River supplies, we're not talking about the only supply of water for Arizona, but it's important. It's an important supply.
Well, sure. I think that, yeah, absolutely. I mean, if it's 40% of the supply. One of the issues you mentioned was groundwater. We surveyed voters in both rural parts of the state and urban parts of the state. Do groundwater issues have different impacts currently in different parts of the state?
Yes, for sure. Within certain designated areas that were really created by the Groundwater Management Act, which Arizona passed in 1980, there are limitations on the development of new wells or on the use of groundwater. There's basically a cap and trade system on groundwater within our 5 active management areas, which include the 3 counties that are in the CAP service territory, and also the Prescott area, and then the Santa Cruz area way down in the southern part of the state. And then we also have 3 areas called irrigation non-expansion areas where new irrigated agriculture is prohibited. So those are the areas where groundwater is managed and subject to regulation, and where large users of groundwater are reporting how much they use. They have meters on their wells so that we can keep track of how much water is being used. Outside of those areas, there's very little limitation on the use of groundwater. You can't pump it and transport it to another basin, with limited exceptions. There are always exceptions. But if you own the land, you can dig a well, you can drill a well, and you can pump, and you don't have to report how much you're using. We're starting to see in some rural areas concern from some of the users, either smaller residential users who don't have, terrifically deep wells, or people who've been there in those places for generations, who are seeing the water tables decline a lot faster than they had expected. And so that's causing people to become concerned about the long-term viability of groundwater as their water supply. Some of this is caused by the influx of new industrial agricultural operations that have moved in and maybe using more water than had been used previously in order to grow food and fiber.
So I think that one of the things that we focus on in terms of what Clean Elections does is we interact and try to facilitate the interaction between voters and candidates for state office. And water, as you've just described, has a complex overlay of federal regulations, state regulations, and then local uses that may be different from place to place. Where in that process do state policymakers fit?
Well, if we were talking at the state level, there really are three sets of elected officials that have a big role. Let's start with the Arizona Corporation Commission. Arizona, especially outside of the cities, has quite a number of private water providers, private water companies, rather than the city being the provider or the town. And it's the Corporation Commission that regulates rates for those providers and has a lot of say in the business of private water companies. So people who have a private water company should be aware that their statewide corporation commissioners are the people who are really the oversight body for their water services. The legislature, the state legislature, is extremely important in Arizona for a couple of reasons. One has to do with water quality. The legislature funds our Department of Environmental Quality, and so any issues related to clean water ultimately redound in many ways to the state legislature. And then also the state legislature has to approve any changes in Arizona's in our compact with the other Colorado River states. There are 7 states, and of course, the Mexico are all participants in this complex set of agreements that have been built up over 100 years. So unlike any other Colorado compact state, Arizona requires legislative approval for Arizona to sign on to changes. So super important there. Yeah. Our legislature regulates groundwater. I mean, the groundwater is a matter of state law. So changes in how groundwater is managed fall to the legislature, very important. And also the legislature can authorize or put a stop to other kinds of practices. For example, some cities are looking to move to direct potable reuse, where they take their treated reclaimed water and then they send it to a drinking water plant to be treated up to potable standards. And the legislature can choose to have a role in helping make DPR happen or making other kinds of changes in water policy happen to help communities be more water resilient. So the other important official here, elected official when it comes to water, is of course our governor. The governor appoints the directors of the 3 major water agencies. I mentioned ADEQ, and the other really important agency is the Department of Water Resources. The head of DWR is the negotiator for the state of Arizona in Colorado River issues, and of course oversees water supply regulation, generally. So a super important position, and that person serves at the pleasure of the governor. A governor can have a huge influence over what happens with water policy in the state.
Sure. So are there right now, maybe in this legislative session and looking forward to the short term, the next couple of sessions, are there specific proposals that are being discussed that start to address some of the developments you've described?
Yeah, there are always quite a few different water proposals that show up in different bills, and some get a hearing, some don't. There's been, I would say, more interest by more members of the legislature in trying to address concerns about groundwater in the areas where groundwater isn't regulated. So that's one big issue. The governor has proposed creating a new state agency that would acquire water supplies or finance water supply development projects, all with a goal of bringing new water supplies into the state. And that would be, that's very much, if it happens, it's going to be a matter of legislative process. And of course, again, because the legislature has so much authority over in-state water supplies, there are various bills for anything from rainwater harvesting to different types of conservation programs or management of surface waters that get written, and they may have some success in the legislative process. But there always are ideas and proposals out every year.
One, sort of final question about this. When voters, they can see with respect to the reservoirs, a bit of what's happening, but some of these issues get abstracted as a policy matter. Mm-hmm. Where will sort of average voters, start to see some of the impacts of the circumstances we discussed more directly, and how can they anticipate that?
Well, there are so many indications that we're moving into a hotter, drier future. And there have been a lot of really dedicated, creative, smart people trying to get Arizona prepared to be ready for a hotter, drier future. We're coming to the point where people will see those plans put into action. There's something really important to keep in mind, and that is that in the part of the US that's impacted by these Colorado River shortages, only about 25% of the supplies are for municipal and industrial use. About 75% are used for agriculture. So we can't fix the Colorado River problem by municipal conservation. We can't conserve enough water to restore lake levels in the big reservoirs, but we can help our communities stretch the supplies they have in hand by conserving. And so a lot of times people go to conservation like, why don't we have a law that says you have to turn the water off or take short showers or whatever it is, or no grass? And all of those things help the municipal provider stretch the supplies over more people or over a longer time period. And that's helpful. That is not going to solve the great big issues related to the Colorado River. So where we'll see impacts locally in that we'll see municipal providers start to push more conservation than they have. They've worked hard to create kind of a culture of conservation in Arizona, but we'll see messages and probably rebate programs and other steps to get people to use less water. Permanent use of less water outside is really the aim of those programs. And some of those programs will be directed at commercial uses as well, to use less water for cooling towers or other types of commercial uses. Where also we may see impacts, I'd be surprised if we don't, are in water supplies available for agriculture. We've already seen that we're in our first tier of shortage on the Colorado River, and farmers in Pinal County had given up their priority to Colorado River water. So they now will not be receiving those supplies and are turning to groundwater. So, how the impacts on ag will play out is is complicated. It's a very complicated issue as far as, these are people's livelihoods. It's about the legacy of agriculture in Arizona. It's about land use. My hope is that urban, the 85% or so of Arizonans who live in urban areas will look to their elected officials to actively engage in creating partnerships between cities and agriculture so that we can have win-win solutions as much as possible.
Well, Sarah, thank you so much for that those explanations. I think those are really interesting. And, you can, for voters who are watching this, we want you to check out our website to take a look at what voters around the state are viewing around this issue. You'll find that voters in different parts of the state, as we've talked about, have different views and different priorities around these issues. Mm-hmm. And also, we want to make sure you know that on our website, you can find all kinds of information about candidates from the Corporation Commission to the governor's office to the legislature, and you can participate in our debate process by leaving a question for our moderators to ask lawmakers, Corporation Commission candidates, and gubernatorial candidates more about the issues of water and water conservation. That's azcleanelections.gov. Thank you to Sarah Porter from the Kyl Center for Water at Arizona State. I really appreciate your time here today, and we'll look forward to seeing you all in our debates and discussions online.
Thank you.